Usually when we talk about a geopolitical event, there's this expectation of distance,
Right.
like reading a history book. You hear about a conflict on the other side of the planet, the news anchors point to a map, and you think, wow, that's terrible. But it feels structurally contained.
Yeah, it feels like something that happens over there while, your day-to-day life just continues uninterrupted over here.
Exactly. But then you look at what is actually happening right now in the global economy, and suddenly that distance just totally evaporates.
It does.
We aren't looking at a contained event anymore. I mean, we're looking at a scenario where it's like you drop this massive jagged boulder into the middle of the ocean, and the resulting tidal wave, it doesn't just hit the neighboring shores. It floods inland, it washes away the roads, and eventually it just seeps right up through the floorboards of your own house.
And, well, that jagged boulder was just dropped directly into the Strait of Hormuz, which is uh, objectively the single most vulnerable choke point in the entire global economic system.
Yeah, and welcome to this deep dive. Because if you're listening to this, you are probably that curious learner who wants a clear, thorough shortcut to being well-informed without, drowning in the absolute fire hose of daily news.
Right. It's exhausting.
It really is. So today, our mission is to map the exact path of this tidal wave. We're going to connect the dots across this massive stack of recent intelligence to show you exactly how a physical blockade in the Middle East is bleeding directly into basically everything.
Everything from the way artificial intelligence companies are re-architecting corporate debt.
Which is wild.
Yeah, to the changing regulatory landscape of global trade, right down to, the cost of your groceries and the actual underlying mathematics of your personal retirement strategy.
Yeah, the through line here is systemic volatility. We're moving from the epicenter of a physical conflict right into the digital warfare space, watching how that cascades into global supply chains and how it forces these structural pivots in massive tech conglomerates and ultimately forces both businesses and everyday people to completely change how they survive a financial squeeze.
Exactly. But before we get into all of that, I should probably briefly mention something about the sources we're pulling from today.
Oh, yeah, good point.
Because the materials we're looking at cover some highly charged political situations and obviously international conflicts. And, we want to make it absolutely clear that we are remaining strictly neutral here. We are just impartially reporting the facts and the varying viewpoints from the provided intelligence. We're not endorsing any political side or taking a stance on any of the geopolitical actors involved. We're just looking at the mechanics of what's happening.
Right, just laying out the pieces on the board. So, okay, let's start with the physical catalyst for all of this volatility, which is the ongoing U.S. war against Iran. This is now stretched into, its fifth week?
Yeah, fifth week.
And President Donald Trump recently gave a national address indicating that this conflict is not ending anytime soon. He literally stated the military operations will continue for weeks, and he vowed to hit Iran, quote, extremely hard.
Which the markets immediately reacted to.
Violently. I mean, the immediate reaction in the commodities market was huge. U.S. West Texas Intermediate, or WTI crude, it surged over 11%. It pushed past $111 a barrel. And then Brent crude, which is the international benchmark, that topped $109.
Right.
But here's what I don't really understand about this, because President Trump specifically noted in his address that the United States imports almost no oil through the Strait of Hormuz anymore.
Yes, he did.
He literally said, we haven't needed it and we don't need it. So if we are producing our own energy, why is U.S. crude spiking 11%? I mean, why are buyers in Houston suddenly willing to pay a $5.50 premium over the futures contract just to get physical barrels today?
Because energy independence is largely a political talking point. It's not really an economic reality, and that comes down to the way oil is priced.
Okay, walk me through that.
So oil is a globally fungible commodity. It does not matter if the U.S. pumps enough oil out of the Permian Basin to, cover its own domestic consumption. The price of that Texas oil is still set by the global market.
Oh, interesting.
Right, so before this conflict, roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply passed through the Strait of Hormuz. It's this incredibly narrow waterway between Oman and Iran.
Right.
And with Iran effectively shutting it down through these attacks on tankers, 20% of the global supply is suddenly it's in jeopardy. So if South Korea or Japan or Germany suddenly cannot get their oil from the Middle East, their economies don't just, stop.
All right, they have to get it somewhere.
Exactly. They go to the open market, and they start buying oil from everywhere else. They bid up the price of oil produced in Norway, in Brazil, and yes, in Texas and North Dakota.
So it's basically an arbitrage situation. The Texas oil producer isn't going to sell oil to a refinery in Ohio for, like, $70 a barrel if a buyer in Tokyo is totally desperate and willing to pay $110 a barrel.
Exactly. Why would they take a discount? The domestic price just rises to match the global panic.
Okay, that makes perfect sense.
And, I mean, the scale of this panic is exactly what the market is pricing in right now. TD Securities estimates that nearly 1 billion barrels of oil and refined products could be lost by the end of this month alone.
A billion barrels. That's hard to even conceptualize.
It's massive.
Yeah.
And Rapidan Energy is forecasting a net loss of 630 million barrels by the end of June. And keep in mind, that is a net loss, meaning they have already factored in the emergency stockpile releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Oh, wow. So even with the emergency reserves, we're still down that much.
Yeah, and they factored in the rerouting of pipelines that bypass the strait. You simply cannot replace that volume of physical liquid. I mean, Shell CEO Wael Sawan was explicitly warning about this cascading effect.
What did he say?
He anticipates that the fuel shortages will start as rolling blackouts and actual rationing in South Asia. Then that moves to Southeast and Northeast Asia. And by April, those physical shortages are going to hit Europe.
It really is like a giant interconnected circulatory system. Like, you put a tourniquet on the Strait of Hormuz and it doesn't just hurt the arm, the whole body loses circulation. The pressure builds up everywhere until the system just starts failing.
Right, and that pressure hits the American consumer directly at the pump.
Yeah, the data from the sources indicates U.S. retail gas could hit like $4.25 to $4.45 a gallon, and diesel surging up to $6.05.
Which is brutal for logistics.
Exactly. And this brings up a very heavy historical parallel because the sources continuously point back to the 1970s, the 1973 Arab oil embargo, the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
Yeah.
But beyond just the price at the pump, what was the actual structural consequence of the 1970s energy crisis? Because, when I think of that era, the cultural memory is mostly just Richard Nixon instituting a 55-mile-per-hour national speed limit and Jimmy Carter going on TV asking people to wear sweaters and turn down their thermostats.
Right, the cardigans. But the cultural memory often totally misses the brutal macroeconomic reality of that era, which was this concept of stagflation.
Stagflation. Okay, explain that for me.
So before the 1970s oil shocks, Keynesian economic theory basically dictated that inflation and unemployment were inversely related, meaning if you had high inflation, you had low unemployment, and vice versa. You couldn't have both at the same time. But the oil embargo broke that model entirely. The sudden artificial scarcity of energy drove the cost of manufacturing and transportation so high that businesses had to raise prices, creating inflation, while simultaneously laying off workers because they couldn't afford to run their factories.
Wow. So you get the worst of both worlds.
Exactly. You had rampant inflation combined with economic stagnation, hence stagflation. And the psychological damage of that on the American public was profound.
Because it shattered that whole post-World War II belief that the government could just smoothly manage the economy.
Yes, exactly. There's a historian, Meg Jacobs, noted in the sources, and she said that if Watergate taught Americans their presidents lied, the energy crisis showed them the government simply didn't work.
That is a powerful way to put it.
It really is. The inflation psychology became so deeply entrenched in the minds of consumers that they started buying goods immediately, assuming the price would just be higher next week.
Which, of course, only fueled further inflation. A self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. It actually took Paul Volcker taking over the Federal Reserve and intentionally jacking up interest rates to unprecedented levels, we're talking near 20%, to induce a severe punishing recession. He essentially had to crush the economy to break the psychological expectation of inflation.
That's terrifying.
And today, that is the invisible fear haunting the Federal Reserve. A sustained disruption in the Strait of Hormuz risks reigniting that exact inflationary psychology right as central banks, thought they finally had it under control.
Now, there was a tiny glimmer of diplomatic movement mentioned in the sources. The Iranian state news agency, IRNA, reported that Iran and Oman are drafting a protocol to monitor transit in the strait.
Yes, I saw that.
An Iranian official stated that traffic should be supervised and coordinated with the two countries, so framing it not as a blockade, but as, an effort to ensure safe passage.
A subtle shift in rhetoric.
Exactly. And just that report alone, just the hint of a bureaucratic protocol caused U.S. stock indexes to suddenly turn higher and oil prices to ease off their daily peaks.
Hmm.
It just shows how incredibly desperate the market is for any kind of diplomatic off-ramp.
It really does. But the diplomatic off-ramp is really complicated right now by the fact that the battlefield has fundamentally evolved.
How so?
Well, we are no longer just dealing with kinetic military action or, physical blockades of waterways. The conflict is simultaneously being waged in the digital information space.
Yeah.
And the tactics being used are radically different from anything we saw in the 20th century.
Yeah, this transition from the physical blockade to the digital blockade is absolutely fascinating. We are watching modern warfare blend kinetic strikes with, like, aesthetic, mimetic warfare. The battle for the narrative is being fought on platforms like X and Facebook, and Iran has adopted this incredibly bizarre, highly unconventional strategy.
It's definitely unconventional.
They aren't broadcasting stoic military parades or traditional propaganda. They are using AI-generated Lego memes.
It sounds totally absurd on the surface.
It does. Like, I was reading the sources, and they describe videos depicting an animated, panicked Donald Trump in Lego form ordering an airstrike after reviewing the quote-unquote Epstein file alongside a Lego Satan.
Right.
I mean, they have released rap diss tracks calling the U.S. president a loser, playing over images of stock market sell-offs. But my real question is about the efficacy of this. It feels like throwing a million random digital artifacts into the void and just hoping something goes viral. Is a Lego meme actually capable of eroding U.S. allied support, or is it just the equivalent of geopolitical internet trolling?
It's actually highly calculated mimetic warfare. The choice of the medium is the weapon itself. A political science professor in the source material specifically noted that using a medium like Legos lowers people's psychological defenses.
Lowering defenses? How?
Well, think about it. If a foreign adversary broadcasts a hyper-realistic violent threat, the viewer's cognitive defense mechanisms immediately activate, right? They recognize it as enemy propaganda and they reject it.
Oh, I see.
But a Lego animation bypasses that filter. It makes complex, violent, or subversive geopolitical themes easily digestible. It makes them humorous and, critically, highly shareable. Iran's primary objective here isn't to convince their own citizens, who are largely subjected to severe internet blackouts anyway.
Right.
The objective is to inject grievance, amplify domestic conspiracy theories, and seed anti-war sentiment directly into these fragmented Western audiences.
So they're targeting the specific domestic vulnerabilities of the U.S. administration. They're pulling the threads of, like, market volatility and the intense public fascination with the Jeffrey Epstein conspiracy theories to delegitimize the administration's authority to wage war.
Exactly.
And the U.S. response is fighting on that exact same aesthetic territory. The White House has been releasing social media videos using video game and movie-style edits of actual military strikes. They're taking raw footage of the destruction of Iranian facilities and packaging it with high-octane aesthetics, aggressive soundtracks, fast cuts. It's like they're trying to captivate younger, digitally native audiences by projecting strength through the visual language of, like, a Call of Duty montage.
It represents a total gamification of military conflict. But the real danger here is that these digital narratives do not stay contained online.
They never do.
No, they have severe real-world consequences. And we are seeing that play out at the highest levels of the U.S. government right now. The Epstein narrative, which foreign adversaries are actively weaponizing to create discord, has been boiling over domestically to the point of causing a literal cabinet-level earthquake.
Yeah, the demand for radical transparency regarding the Department of Justice's Epstein files has culminated in President Trump firing his Attorney General, Pam Bondi.
Which is huge.
Firing the head of the Justice Department during a major international military conflict is a staggering development.
It is.
The sources indicate the president was increasingly frustrated with her handling of those files, especially after Congress explicitly mandated their release. The DOJ was perceived as, dragging its feet, withholding millions of documents, and the political base was furious.
Right.
So Bondi is out, and Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, who was formerly the president's criminal defense lawyer, is stepping in as the acting attorney general, with EPA Chief Lee Zeldin being floated as a potential permanent replacement.
And the instability at the DOJ actually goes deeper than just the Epstein files. Bondi's dismissal also arrived in the wake of a highly embarrassing structural collapse of 2 major federal criminal prosecutions against high-profile political adversaries of the administration.
Oh, you mean former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James?
Yes.
I read about that structural collapse, and it sounds like a massive unforced error. Like a federal judge tossed both of those cases because the interim U.S. attorney who obtained the indictments, Lindsay Halligan, was found to be invalidly appointed. The mechanics of her appointment somehow violated the Federal Vacancies Reform Act. So you have this total breakdown in the basic legal plumbing of the DOJ, combined with this intense meme-fueled pressure from the political base for radical transparency, and it results in the functional decapitation of the Justice Department.
It perfectly illustrates the tension between trying to control a narrative and trying to maintain functional governance. And, it creates this striking contrast with the administration's focus on physical legacy projects.
What do you mean?
Well, while the Justice Department is in turmoil and the digital war is raging on social media, the administration is aggressively pushing forward with massive, highly visible construction projects right in Washington.
The $400 million White House ballroom.
Yes.
Despite a federal judge ordering a halt to the construction, a 90,000 square foot ballroom project just received final approval from the National Capital Planning Commission. A private nonprofit group, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, actually sued to stop it. And their argument is fundamentally about stewardship. They argue the president is a temporary steward, not the owner of the White House. And unilaterally deciding to demolish the East Wing to build a structure nearly twice the size of the original mansion is a violation of that stewardship.
But the Planning Commission, which happens to be chaired by a top White House aide, pushed the approval through anyway.
Wow.
It is a profound assertion of executive power over physical space. But, this intense focus on high-level geopolitical posturing, mimetic warfare, and domestic political legacy, it inevitably flows downstream. The friction generated in Washington and the Middle East doesn't just stay in those capitals, it hits the global supply chains.
Which means it eventually hits your wallet. So let's trace how that friction moves from the Strait of Hormuz directly into the American consumer economy. Because starting April 17th, Amazon is implementing a 3.5% fuel and logistics-related surcharge on U.S. and Canadian third-party sellers who use Fulfillment by Amazon, or FBA. Now, on the surface, the company estimates this surcharge only adds about 17 cents per unit shipped. That sounds, honestly, pretty negligible. 17 cents on a $30 item doesn't seem like a structural shift.
Right, but you have to look at the scale and the actual mechanics of the FBA ecosystem. Amazon hosts roughly 2 million active third-party sellers.
2 million?
Yeah. And when a seller uses FBA, they ship their inventory in bulk to Amazon's warehouses. Amazon then handles the picking, the packing, the routing, and the final mile delivery. Now, Amazon has historically absorbed minor fluctuations in fuel costs to keep the platform attractive.
Right, to keep sellers happy.
Exactly. But with diesel surging past $6 a gallon due to the Middle East conflict, the cost of moving millions of packages a day becomes mathematically unsustainable. That 17 cents per unit, multiplied by billions of units, represents a massive reallocation of capital.
So Amazon is basically shifting the burden of macroeconomic volatility onto the sellers.
Yes. And those small businesses operate on very tight margins, meaning they will inevitably reprice their goods higher to protect their profitability. So at the end of the day, the consumer pays the surcharge.
And it isn't just cardboard boxes arriving at your door. The exact same energy mechanics are hitting the food supply. Grocery prices are facing a massive shock, and the timing could not be more critical as we approach the U.S. elections. But help me connect the dots here. Why does a conflict in the Middle East make my groceries more expensive within a matter of months?
Because modern commercial agriculture is incredibly energy intensive. It is essentially the process of converting fossil fuels into food.
Okay, that's a wild way to think about it.
But it's true. The increase in the global price of oil raises the price of diesel. Diesel is required to run the massive tractors that till and harvest the fields. It runs the freight trains that move the bulk commodities, and it fuels the trucks that make the final delivery to the supermarket. Furthermore, the physical closure of the Strait of Hormuz chokes off significant global supplies of natural gas and petrochemicals, which are the fundamental building blocks of modern synthetic fertilizers.
Ah, okay. And the sources highlighted a specific example regarding fresh produce that makes this connection crystal clear for me.
The strawberry example, right?
Yes. So if you are growing a bulk commodity like wheat or field corn, you harvest it, dry it, and you can store it in a silo for a long time. It isn't highly sensitive to time, but Fresh produce, like a pint of strawberries, cannot be stockpiled.
No, it rots.
Exactly. The moment it is picked, a clock starts ticking. It requires constant, uninterrupted refrigeration. It goes from a refrigerated packing house to a refrigerated truck to a refrigerated display case in the store.
And that entire cold chain demands immense amounts of energy.
Right. Plus, the strawberries are packaged in those little plastic clamshells, which are derived from petrochemicals. So that single pint of strawberries is getting hit by the oil shock twice. Once through the plastic packaging and continually through the refrigerated transport before you even scan the barcode.
And this is exactly why agricultural economists are warning of a delayed but severe spike in food inflation. Farmers in the Northern Hemisphere are making their planting decisions and purchasing their inputs right now.
So the costs are getting locked in.
Right. The grain that is currently sitting on the shelves was harvested last year. Its cost is sunk. But the new crops currently going into the ground will bear the full inflated cost of this expensive fertilizer and diesel.
And when do we see that?
Come late summer and early fall, which, by the way, perfectly coincides with the final stretch of the election season. Those higher input costs will finally hit the grocery aisles.
Wow. And while consumers are bracing for inflation from global fuel shocks, they are simultaneously navigating a radically changing landscape of import taxes. We just passed the one-year anniversary of what the administration dubbed Liberation Day tariffs.
Yes, April 2025.
Right. Steep, country-specific tariffs were implemented, including a 34% levy on Chinese goods and a 20% levy on the European Union. Now, I want to be really precise here because the mechanics of tariffs are so often misunderstood in the media.
Oh, absolutely.
When the U.S. puts a 34% tariff on a Chinese good, the Chinese government isn't writing a check to the U.S. Treasury. The American company importing that good pays the tax at the border, and they usually just pass that cost right on to the American consumer.
Correct. The stated goal of the tariff policy was to force a fundamental rebalancing of global trade and heavily incentivize domestic manufacturing. The administration basically wanted to make importing so painful that companies would have no choice but to build factories in the United States. And while some of those initial extreme rates were later reduced during bilateral trade negotiations, and, the Supreme Court ultimately struck down the administration's attempt to apply a blanket global tariff without congressional approval, the underlying environment remains incredibly volatile. And that volatility has fundamentally altered global capital flows. Investors have reassessed the concept of American exceptionalism.
Because the U.S. equity market used to be the default safe haven, right? Like when global chaos hit, capital fled to the S&P 500.
Always.
But since those aggressive tariff policies went into effect, creating trade wars with both adversaries and allies, we are seeing benchmark indexes in places like Japan and the UK actually outperform the U.S. markets. Global investors are hedging their bets. It's like a financial game of musical chairs, and the U.S. is deliberately taking chairs away from the global table.
That's a great analogy.
But it brings me to a contradiction here. If the U.S. is heavily taxing imports to force domestic manufacturing, but the economy is simultaneously suffering from global fuel inflation, aren't consumers just trapped in a vice, like getting squeezed from both sides?
They are paying the price of transition. The administration is using tariffs as a blunt, coercive instrument to force supply chains to relocate back to the U.S., prioritizing long-term domestic security over short-term price stability.
And we see the purest distillation of this strategy in the pharmaceutical sector, don't we?
We do. The administration just announced they are preparing to slap up to a 100% tariff on imported patented drugs and their active pharmaceutical ingredients.
100% tariff on medicine. If that applied universally, it would instantly trigger a catastrophic healthcare crisis in the U.S., given how reliant we are on drug ingredients synthesized in India and China.
It absolutely would, but there is a deliberate escape hatch designed into the policy. The tariff starts at 20% and aggressively scales to 100% over a 4-year period. However, drug makers who fully execute pricing agreements with the Department of Health and Human Services and who legally commit to building the necessary manufacturing plants domestically by January 2029 receive a full exemption.
Oh, wow. So it's textbook economic coercion.
Yes. The government is essentially holding access to the highly lucrative U.S. consumer market hostage to force pharmaceutical giants like Pfizer and Eli Lilly to onshore their production. And it is actually working to a degree. Over $400 billion in commitments to reshore manufacturing have already been logged.
So the grand strategy is that in 5 to 10 years, you have fully secured domestic drug supply lines that are immune to global shipping choke points. But in the short term, You inject massive friction, uncertainty, and cost into the system. And that friction doesn't just exist in abstract economic data. It is currently showing up in the balance sheets of some of the most important companies in the world. As we look at the market realities, the tech sector and the labor market are flashing some very concerning signals. Let's examine what is happening with Tesla.
Tesla's Q1 delivery numbers were a significant miss. They delivered 358,023 vehicles, which represents a 14% drop from the previous quarter. Furthermore, their energy deployment business, which includes their massive battery storage systems, also fell sharply.
Which is their other big growth engine.
Right. And consequently, the stock took a heavy hit, dropping over 5%.
Now, a 14% drop in deliveries is terrible, but normally Wall Street might just write that off as a bad quarter caused by high interest rates making car loans expensive. But analysts are pointing to something much deeper here. They are pointing to a structural pivot by Elon Musk.
Yeah, a massive pivot.
He is actively phasing out the legacy Model S and Model X vehicles. Why would you shut down production lines for high-margin luxury cars? The sources suggest he is clearing that factory space in California to build Optimus humanoid robots and to focus entirely on autonomous cybercabs.
Tesla is in the middle of a brutal identity crisis. They are seemingly sacrificing their core electric vehicle business, the business that literally made them a trillion-dollar company, in favor of a fully autonomous future.
And the timing is wild.
They are doing this at a moment of peak vulnerability. They are facing intense global competition, particularly from Chinese EV makers like BYD, who can manufacture cars at a fraction of the cost. Additionally, in the U.S. market, the $7,500 federal EV tax incentive has ended, abruptly removing a massive consumer subsidy. Tesla is deliberately abandoning the present to build a highly speculative future, which is an incredibly risky maneuver when your current cash flow still relies on manufacturing and selling physical cars.
Yeah, it's an all-in bet. But the anxiety isn't just confined to hardware manufacturing. It is aggressively spreading into the software sector and the private credit markets that fund it. This brings us to Blue Owl.
Blue Owl?
Yeah. Blue Owl is a massive private credit firm, and they recently had to implement a 5% cap on redemptions for 2 of their non-traded funds. I want to break down exactly what this means because it is a vital indicator of systemic fear.
So, to understand why this is alarming, you have to understand the mechanics of private credit. After the 2008 financial crisis, traditional banks were heavily regulated, and they basically stopped lending to riskier mid-sized companies. Private credit firms filled that void.
Okay.
They pool money from wealthy institutional investors like pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and they lend it directly to businesses at high interest rates. When those investors get spooked and want their money back, they request a redemption.
And usually, a fund plans for a certain amount of liquidity to handle normal redemptions. But Blue Owl's flagship fund saw requests for 21.9% of its shares, and their tech-focused ODIC fund saw a staggering 40.7% redemption request rate in a single quarter.
Which is almost unheard of.
Nearly half the fund wanted out immediately. Blue Owl had to throw up the gates and cap withdrawals at 5% simply to prevent a catastrophic run on the bank. But why the sudden panic? Why are these sophisticated, highly capitalized investors sprinting for the exits? The firm explicitly blamed, quote, heightened market concerns around AI-related disruption to software companies.
Right. Because for the last decade, software as a service, or SaaS, was considered the absolute safest bet in technology lending.
Why is that?
Well, a software company builds a product once, and the marginal cost of selling another copy is essentially zero. They lock businesses into sticky multi-year subscriptions. That creates guaranteed recurring cash flow.
Oh, and lenders love recurring cash flow.
Exactly. Private credit firms loved lending to SaaS companies because that recurring cash flow was perfect for servicing high-interest debt. But generative artificial intelligence changes the fundamental math. AI agents are increasingly proving they can write code, automate complex workflows, and essentially build bespoke software solutions on the fly.
So if an AI agent can instantly perform the function of a specialized, expensive software suite, the traditional software company just gets disintermediated. Their customers cancel their subscriptions. That guaranteed cash flow vanishes practically overnight.
And if the cash flow vanishes, the software company defaults on the massive loans it took from the private credit firm.
Wow. The institutional investors realize that the collateral backing their private credit investments might just be rendered obsolete by AI.
Precisely. According to Jefferies, software represents about 20% of portfolio exposure in business development companies, which are essentially the publicly traded proxies for the private credit market. If the AI disruption thesis plays out and a wave of SaaS companies start defaulting, the multi-trillion-dollar private credit market faces a massive structural reckoning.
And while the high finance world wrestles with the existential threat of AI, the foundation of the economy, the labor market, is frozen in amber.
It really is.
The upcoming March jobs report is forecasting a gain of only 59,000 jobs, yet the unemployment rate is projected to hold perfectly steady at 4.4%. Walk me through the actual demographic math here, because 59,000 jobs in a country of over 330 million people is practically a rounding error. How does the economy add so few jobs without the unemployment rate spiking to 5 or 6%?
It comes down to a fundamental shift in labor force dynamics,
Yeah.
driven by aging demographics and severe immigration restrictions. The St. Louis Federal Reserve recently updated their research on the break-even level of job growth.
What exactly is the break-even level?
The break-even level is the exact number of jobs the economy needs to create each month, simply to absorb new entrants into the workforce and keep the unemployment rate flat. In 2025, before demographic retirements peaked and immigration policies tightened, that break-even number was over 150,000 jobs a month.
Wow.
Today, economists have recalculated the math. They believe the break-even number has plummeted to between 87,000 and as low as 15,000 jobs.
Wait, really? If the bar for a healthy labor market has been lowered from 150,000 jobs to just 15,000 jobs to keep unemployment steady, aren't we fundamentally redefining what a good economy is?
In many ways, yes.
It feels like we are grading the health of the country on a massive demographic curve. A report showing 59,000 jobs a few years ago would have signaled an imminent recession. Today, it is considered equilibrium. But beneath the headline unemployment rate, the actual hiring rate has fallen to 3.1%, which is the lowest level since the 2020 pandemic crash. Businesses aren't firing people, but they certainly aren't hiring. The churn of the economy has just stopped.
And, when traditional engines of growth like population expansion and routine software development begin to stall, the capital inside the system doesn't just disappear. It searches for new structures. We are currently witnessing a fascinating systemic re-architecting of media, entertainment, and finance. As the old systems freeze, we see a cycle of decentralization moving rapidly back toward new forms of centralization.
The media landscape provides the starkest example of this. The Wall Street Journal reported that OpenAI, the titan of artificial intelligence, just acquired a technology news podcast called TBPN.
Right.
This is a show hosted by John Coogan and Jordy Hayes. It only launched in 2025. They have a relatively microscopic audience of just 58,000 YouTube subscribers. But the influence of that specific audience is so dense that the podcast is pulling in $30 million in advertising revenue this year alone.
It highlights the complete collapse of the legacy media distribution model. Audiences are fleeing institutional cable news networks in favor of creator-led, independent platforms that offer deep, niche expertise. TBPN built incredible leverage by securing interviews with the architects of the modern tech world, Mark Zuckerberg, Satya Nadella, Sam Altman.
They bypass the traditional PR gatekeepers entirely.
Exactly. But the acquisition by OpenAI is the true signal here. OpenAI recognizes that to maintain control over the cultural and regulatory narratives surrounding artificial general intelligence, they cannot rely on legacy media. They need to directly own the independent, decentralized voices that the technology community actually trusts.
But doesn't that inherently compromise the very product they are buying? Like if a company building artificial general intelligence purchases a journalism outfit dedicated to covering artificial general intelligence, the conflict of interest is blinding.
They stated they will maintain the podcast's editorial independence, but...
Right. But the structural reality is that the independent voice is now a subsidiary of the very titan it is supposed to critique. It is the rapid centralization of decentralized media. And we are seeing the exact same unbundling and re-centralizing dynamic play out in the world of professional sports broadcasting.
Oh, absolutely. The Regional Sports Network, or RSN model, is finally collapsing under the accumulated weight of cord cutting. For decades, the RSN was a license to print money.
Yeah, everybody had cable.
They bundled local baseball, hockey, and basketball games into expensive cable packages, forcing every subscriber to pay for sports whether they watched them or not. But as consumers cut the cord, the economics inverted. Main Street Sports, which owned roughly 15 channels broadcasting MLB, NHL, and NBA games, is officially winding down its operations because they can no longer make the massive rights payments to the teams.
It's really the end of an era for the American sports fan. The simple act of turning on your local cable package to watch the hometown baseball team is evaporating. Because Main Street Sports failed, Major League Baseball has been forced to step in and take over the media distribution for 14 of its own teams.
Right.
We also saw Comcast, which is one of the pioneers of the cable bundle, sell its stake in SNY, the network that broadcasts the New York Mets, to Charter Communications. The old, highly profitable centralized bundle broke apart into a decentralized, frustrating mess of individual streaming apps. And now, the leagues themselves are trying to re-centralize the rights just to survive.
This tension between decentralized chaos and centralized control is the defining battle of the current financial regulatory environment as well. We see it clearly in the fight over prediction markets. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, is currently taking the extraordinary step of suing 3 U.S. states, Arizona, Connecticut, and Illinois.
Wait, why is a federal regulatory commission dragging individual states into court over finance laws?
Over the exclusive right to regulate and control prediction markets like Kalshi and Polymarket.
Oh.
These are platforms where users can place financial wagers on the outcomes of future events. Everything from the results of the presidential election to the monthly inflation data, or even the winners of the Academy Awards. These markets have skyrocketed in popularity, acting as alternative data sources.
Right, people are using them instead of polls.
Exactly. The states, citing consumer protection laws and anti-gambling statutes, tried to step in and outlaw or severely hamper these activities within their borders. The CFTC is suing to assert federal supremacy. They argue that a fragmented state-by-state patchwork of regulations is exactly the kind of chaotic environment Congress created the CFTC to prevent.
It is the classic American struggle between state sovereignty and federal power playing out in the newest financial casino. But here is the fascinating twist. While the CFTC is fighting state regulators to maintain control over prediction markets, the cryptocurrency industry is actively begging for that exact same federal oversight. Coinbase just received conditional approval from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the OCC, to operate as a federal trust bank.
Which represents a monumental legitimizing shift for the cryptocurrency sector. Coinbase has built a massive global payment strategy centered around stablecoins, specifically USDC. But to operate nationally within the United States, they have historically been forced to acquire money transmitter licenses in all 50 states.
Which means complying with 50 different, often contradictory sets of regulations.
Exactly. By securing a federal trust charter, they consolidate their oversight. They submit to one rigorous federal rulebook.
I look at it this way. For Coinbase, operating under 50 different state regulators is like playing street ball with 50 different sets of neighborhood rules. Getting the OCC charter is like stepping straight into the NBA with professional referees and a standardized playbook.
That's a very accurate comparison.
Now, they aren't becoming a traditional commercial bank-like. They aren't allowed to take retail deposits from your checking account and lend them out fractionally to buy mortgages. But the charter gives them the legal authority and the banking infrastructure to process stablecoin payments and settlements on a massive institutional scale. It is the ultimate irony of the digital age. The pioneers of decentralized, trustless finance are seeking the ultimate centralized federal approval simply to ensure their own survival.
And survival is the operative word that connects all of these macro trends we've discussed today. We have discussed geopolitics, global trade shocks, macroeconomic labor data, and corporate restructuring. But for you, the listener, the most pressing question isn't how Coinbase survives or how Amazon adjusts its logistics network.
Right.
The question is, what does this mean for me? How are local businesses and everyday people actually surviving this multi-front economic squeeze right now?
Let's examine how corporations are defending their margins first. Coca-Cola just launched a massive new advertising campaign. But it is very unusual. It isn't just a commercial about how refreshing Coke is. It actively features 13 different major restaurant chains. Domino's, Wendy's, Panda Express, White Castle, among others.
Right.
The ads specifically depict people ordering food from these specific brands and ending their order with the phrase, "and a Coke."
It is a brilliant look at the microeconomics of corporate survival in an inflationary environment. Restaurant traffic fell 2% in February, and consumer surveys indicate 38% of people are actively reducing how often they dine out.
Because it's just too expensive.
Exactly. Restaurants inherently operate on razor-thin margins, and the single most profitable item on any restaurant menu is the fountain beverage. The markup on a cup of syrup and carbonated water is astronomical. Coca-Cola realizes they are not just a vendor, they are a strategic business partner in an ecosystem.
So if the restaurants go bankrupt because consumers stop buying high-margin combos, Coke's fountain business collapses.
Yes. So Coca-Cola is spending its own massive marketing budget to subsidize the advertising of its partners. They are driving traffic to Wendy's to ensure Wendy's survive long enough to keep buying Coke syrup.
When they grow, we grow, as the Coca-Cola executive stated. It is an act of corporate symbiosis born out of necessity. But corporations have marketing budgets and pricing power. What about the individual? When inflation proves sticky, when gas is surging back past $4 and grocery bills are climbing again, everyday people need cash.
They do.
The financial reporting in our sources highlights 4 primary methods consumers are using to find liquidity in a pinch. Let's walk through these because, frankly, when you look at the mechanics, they all sound incredibly dangerous.
The baseline reality is stark. Data shows 45% of Americans have less than $1,000 in emergency savings.
Which is terrifying.
It is. When a sudden shock hits, a medical bill, a major car repair, or simply the cumulative weight of inflation, they are forced to turn to leverage. The first option highlighted is tapping home equity through a HELOC C, a home equity line of credit. Lenders like Figure or PNC allow homeowners to borrow cash against the appreciated value of their house.
Right, but the mechanism there is that you are putting your primary residence up as collateral. If the economy takes a turn, you lose your job, and you cannot make the HELOC payment, the bank can foreclose on your house. You are risking your shelter to pay for immediate expenses.
Yes.
The second option is an unsecured personal loan, originated through fintech companies like Discover or Upstart. You don't put up collateral, and you can get the money deposited the next day.
But the cost of that unsecured capital is punishing.
Yeah.
The average annual percentage rate, or APR, on a personal loan recently sat over 11%, and that is for borrowers with excellent credit. For those with lower credit scores, the interest rates can quickly approach payday lending levels, creating a debt spiral that is mathematically impossible to escape. The third option, heavily marketed to consumers, is the 0% APR credit card, such as the U.S. Bank Shield Visa. These cards offer a promotional period, sometimes up to 21 billing cycles, where no interest accrues on the balance.
But the trap is in the fine print. You still have to make the minimum monthly payments, and if you do not clear the entire principal balance before that introductory period expires, the promotional rate vanishes, and you are retroactively hit with a standard APR that averages around 21%. It isn't a financial lifeline. It's a payday loan dressed up as a premium rewards perk.
Exactly. Which leaves the final option, borrowing from your own 401k retirement plan.
Tell me about that one.
Taking a loan from your 401k requires no credit check because you are borrowing your own money. The interest you pay goes back into your own account. However, if you are laid off or leave your job, the entire loan balance typically becomes due immediately.
Oh, that's risky.
Very. If you cannot repay it, the IRS treats it as an early withdrawal, hitting you with income taxes plus a 10% penalty. Furthermore, by pulling the money out of the market, you permanently lose the compounding growth on that capital during the years it takes you to pay it back.
When you look at these 4 options, risking your house, taking an 11% personal loan, gambling on a 0% credit card trap, or rating your retirement, aren't these just 4 different flavors of taking on high-stakes debt when you are already in a vulnerable position? You are trying to solve a cash flow problem by introducing toxic liabilities into your household balance sheet. It's like trying to put out a fire with kerosene.
It is a profound systemic risk, but for tens of millions of people, it is the only viable option to survive the month. And that concept of rating retirement savings leads us directly into our final and perhaps most critical financial concept of this deep dive.
Yeah.
Sequence of returns risk.
Right.
This is the mathematical trapdoor that awaits anyone preparing to stop working.
I want to spend time on this because it is vital. Explain how sequence of returns risk actually works.
When you are in the accumulation phase of your life, when you are working and saving a portion of your paycheck into an index fund every month, market volatility is actually your friend. If the stock market drops 20%, your monthly contribution simply buys more shares at a cheaper price.
Right, dollar cost averaging.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When the market eventually recovers, you profit. But the mathematics completely invert the moment you retire. When you transition from accumulation to distribution, when you start selling your assets to pay for your groceries and property taxes, the specific sequence of the market returns dictates whether you die wealthy or die broke.
So it is not just about the average annual return over a 30-year retirement. It is entirely about when the good years and the bad years happen.
Precisely. Let's walk through the mathematical example provided by Fidelity in the sources. Imagine a retiree who has accumulated a $1 million portfolio. They plan to withdraw $50,000 a year to live on, adjusting slightly for inflation.
Okay, a 5% withdrawal rate.
Right. Imagine this retiree steps out of the workforce right into the teeth of a bear market, a severe recession where the market drops significantly in their first few years of retirement. They still need that $50,000 to live. So they are forced to sell their shares while the prices are deeply depressed.
They are cashing out at the absolute bottom.
Yes. Because they had to sell so many shares just to generate their $50,000, they have permanently shrunk their underlying capital base. When the market finally recovers 5 years later, they have significantly fewer shares left to participate in the rally. In that scenario, despite the market eventually going on a historic bull run, the damage was done early. Their $1 million is entirely depleted in 27 years.
But if you take that exact same 30-year period of market returns and you simply reverse the order in which they happen.
Yes. If they retire into a booming bull market and the positive returns happen in the first decade, their portfolio grows much faster than their $50,000 withdrawals depleted. By the time a severe bear market hits 10 or 15 years later, their capital base has grown so large that it can easily absorb the hit without threatening their survival.
Wow.
In that scenario, experiencing the exact same average market returns, but in a favorable sequence, they don't run out of money. They end up with over $3 million left over after 30 years. The timing of your retirement, the sequence of the returns you face on day one, dictates your financial survival.
That is brutal. It means anyone considering retiring right now amidst physical oil shocks, AI disintermediating the labor market, unpredictable tariff regimes, and global geopolitical chaos has to be incredibly conservative about their withdrawal rates.
They do.
If your survival requires pulling 6% of your portfolio out every year, you are in extreme danger of sequence of returns risk. If you can survive on pulling just 1% or 2% because you have Social Security or you pick up part-time work, you give your portfolio the breathing room to weather the storm. It is all about having enough of a cash cushion so that you are never forced to sell your assets when they are bleeding.
Which brings our analysis full circle, really. The geopolitical shock of a drone strike in the Middle East forces shipping companies to reroute, which drives up the cost of diesel, which forces Amazon to raise fulfillment fees and farmers to pay more to harvest their crops.
Right.
That drives up the core inflation data, which forces the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates high. High interest rates pressure the valuations of software companies, while AI threatens their business models, causing private credit markets to freeze. And all of that macroeconomic volatility ultimately dictates whether a 65-year-old living in Ohio has to go back to work or can afford to stay retired.
It is a staggering, unbroken chain reaction. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We watched a physical blockade in the Strait of Hormuz send global oil prices surging, threatening to resurrect the stagflation ghosts of the 1970s. We navigated the surreal digital battlefield where AI-generated Lego memes are bypassing our psychological defenses, causing real-world political casualties and cabinet-level decapitations at the Department of Justice.
It's been a lot.
It has. We traced how global conflict directly translates into higher Amazon delivery fees, skyrocketing grocery bills, and coercive pharmaceutical tariffs. We watched Tesla abandon the present to gamble on robotics, while private credit markets tremble at the thought of AI replacing human software engineers. And finally, we saw how the collapse of local sports networks and the rise of federally chartered crypto banks reflect a total re-architecting of our institutions, leaving everyday people to navigate the treacherous mathematics of personal debt and retirement in an inherently volatile world.
The fundamental truth we must extract from this intelligence is that in a hyper-optimized, deeply financialized global economy, there are no isolated events. Every action, whether physical or digital, forces a systemic reaction across multiple, seemingly unrelated sectors of the human experience.
Which brings me back to where we started. That massive, jagged boulder dropped into the ocean. We are watching the tidal wave wash over everything. And in response, we are frantically trying to build dams. We are offshoring our independent media narratives to artificial intelligence titans in the name of reach. We are tying our daily domestic commerce to federally chartered cryptographic stablecoins in the name of efficiency. We are aggressively taxing imports and threatening our own supply lines to force pharmaceutical manufacturing back inside our borders in the name of security. But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you digest all of this information. As we build all these new, heavily fortified walls to protect ourselves from the cascading chaos of the 2020s, we have to ask a critical question. Are we actually building a more resilient society, Or are we just trading our old familiar vulnerabilities for shiny, complex new ones that we do not even know how to measure yet?
That is the defining question we will spend the next decade trying to answer.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this custom deep dive. Keep questioning the narrative, keep looking for the underlying connections, and never stop being curious.